flight was called G Flight, George Flight. And we went very promptly over to Yunnan-Yi in Yunnan province, over towards the mountains, at an elevation, a substantial elevation. You could compare it in the United States probably with Denver, Colorado. And we got over there, and it was September, fall weather, beautiful, dry, very, very nice. It was in a, geologically, in what we would call a Triassic basin, which Chapel Hill, North Carolina is in also.
Yeah, why you were going to China?
Well, I think one reason is the United States wanted to defeat Japan because Japan had attacked the United States. And so we wanted to defeat Japan wherever, whether it was in the Southwest Pacific or in the homeland in Japan eventually, or wherever. And also, it was very important. The United States, I didn't know this at the time, but there was a plan to invade China in, I think, November of 1945. The people who made those plans didn't know anything about the atomic bomb or anything. That wasn't in the picture. The plan was to invade Japan in November 1945. And part of that was to have a force in China that would keep Japanese soldiers from coming back to defend the homeland. Meanwhile, the Japanese had gone in and captured Burma, and they were planning, their plan was to capture India. I actually have money in Indian rupees that were printed in Japan. So our particular group, our small group, was over defending China's western flank. Yunnan and Sichuan are all right next to Tibet up there. And the Japanese were trying to come in from Burma across the Salween River and then to move east and link up in Kunmei with other Japanese who'd be moving west. So then they would control all of China. And our job was to stop them from crossing the Salween River. And we did that in January 1945, was the end of what we called the Salween campaign. And that was the end of that. So we were no longer needed there, but during our early months in China, we were tasked against the Japanese coming from Burma.
Yeah, that's Salween campaign is really a major battle.
Yeah.
Lasting for quite a few months, right?
Yes, and it ended in January '45, and I have a picture. One of our airplanes flying the Chinese generals down to the ceremony that it marked the end of the Salween campaign.
Mm-hmm.
They went down to Mangxi. B-24 bombers flew their own fuel over. They had B-24 airplanes called C-109s that were tankers. And they just filled them up with fuel and flew them over, so the bombers used that fuel. But we had to get ours flown over in drums.
Mm-hmm. And all the fuel had to be flown in from India, right?
Yeah.
So
yes,
you were.
You see what? There was no way of coming into East China because the Japanese controlled the Pacific.
Right.
And Japanese controlled Burma, so the Burma Road had been cut.
Right.
The Burma Road no longer worked. So flying in was the only alternative. And that started off in late 1942 and extended to the end of the war. And I think the cost was 700 and some airplanes that were lost.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
amazing.
Mostly because of weather, flying into the mountains in bad weather.
Yeah.
What we call cumulogranitous clouds. Cumulus clouds with granite mountains in them.
Mm-hmm. And there is a term actually in Chinese, they call it aluminum trail. Because so many planes went down, so you can actually see some of the reflecting from the sky. I mean, when you see it. So
I have the original book of the aluminum trail that a woman spent 40 years right after her husband died on the hump. I've got it up at the cottage. It's spiral bound, but just a few copies in existence. And actually, the second plane that is talked about in that book, they went down in November of 42. I found from the air in January of 45, and somebody actually got to it in October of 2011 and got the tail numbers. And in that case, the pilot was an ex-Flying Tiger. The pilot and co-pilot were American. The radio operator was Chinese, and that plane was operated and owned by the CNA, Chinese National Air. It was not an Air Force plane, but I found the wreckage, and it has now been reached, and the family has been notified, and so on.
And that's called hump operation. I think sometimes they call it a hump operation in Chinese. And there are several monuments, actually. I have seen 2 monuments.
Advisor, Y forces, X forces, and so on. I think they were probably the model for what President Kennedy used in Vietnam when they sent advisors in. Well, we had advisors, American Army advisors in China.
Right. There were also ground support as well, advisors.
Yeah. And of course, the Air Force supported, we had transport planes dropping bags of rice to the Chinese troops and so on. Is it working?
Huh?
Is that working?
Yeah, it's working. I'm just taking a photo.
Because we were trying to bomb all the bridges that the Japanese would try to use.
Right.
Well, very often the bombers would come back and say that bridge number X has been destroyed. And we would send out a photo reconnaissance, and they'd photograph it, and it was a steel bridge, and the bombs had all gone down and blown up in the water. The guys on the bomber saw the thing was blown up, but it wasn't. The bomb just went off in the water. And as a result of that, the next thing that was usually done was to put in time delay bombs. So you would put bombs around either end of the bridge, and they couldn't tell when they were going to go off. They didn't go off when they hit. Some of them went off soon after they hit, some half an hour later, some maybe an hour and a half later, or whatever. So the Japanese would think carefully before approaching the area, because bombs might be going off right there on the railroad tracks or on the road or whatever it was. Well, I saw the plane that I found in January of 1945 that had been shot down in November of 1944.
Okay. But it's not
Not
in action, no. Okay.
And the only time we were flying in B-25, and somebody on the crew, the pilot or co-pilot, somebody said he thought they saw Japanese airplanes coming at us. And what they were American airplanes from India that were identifying us to make sure we weren't Japanese. And they took a look, and then they went on their way. That's the only time I ever saw an American plane flying, except I saw B-29s. I'd never seen a B-29 before. We heard we had a 1-ball alert, you know what the alerts were. We had a 1-ball alert and a 2-ball alert. Said the Japanese Emily's, 4-engine Japanese bombers were coming right at us. We got in the foot tensions and whatnot. And when those planes got within sight, they were B-29s, and they were on a secret mission against Bangkok. We hadn't been notified, of course, where they were going or anything about them, but we realized that they were. And those are the only American planes that we saw, other than the ones that we knew about, our B-25s, B-38s, and when the B-24 mission was going out. But and we very rarely saw Japanese planes. We were it happened, we were bombed by the Japanese on my birthday, which is the 28th of November, which this year is Thanksgiving Day.
Oh.
And I'm glad we're not entertaining Japanese this time.
Okay.
And it was, the crews were, I think, all trained in Texas. It was bigger than the B-17, bigger and heavier and faster and so on. Had a lot of mechanical problems. And they moved into the area around Chengdu. And they built runways up there, a number of different runways, where they moved those planes in. And the runways were all built entirely by hand. No mechanical equipment, no gasoline, no electricity, including the basement of the runway. The different sizes of rocks were all broken up by hand, all put in, tapped down. And finally, the runway was smoothed by big stone or concrete rollers that were pulled by 100 up to 200 Chinese in harness.
Yeah, I've seen those photos. It's pretty amazing.
Well,
Incredible.
There's a real photo in that book, and there's also a painting that a man did of the process, a very nice painting that he gave me to use in the book.
Yeah, I think it's also used in Dan Jackson's YouTube video, and the link I'm going to send it to you after the interview. That was really interesting. Oh yeah, the photo is right here, right?
Yeah.
This photo. So that's the photo. And you took a lot of photos, not just from the air about targets, but you also took a lot of photos of the people on the ground, the Chinese people, and also the soldiers' life, and that's a really precious records actually, because in those days almost no Chinese would have a camera.
No, our Chinese guards, the guard barracks,
Right.
which was right near where our tents were. I photographed a lot of that, and our relationship was so good with the Chinese. We had. I was struck by two things. You understand that Yunnan that part of Yunnan was very rural area. It was a totally different, say, from Shanghai or Hangzhou.
Oh, yes.
And it was a totally rural area. And so a kid was born and grew up in a village. And as you flew over, you saw these villages were just spots. And from each village, you could see the trails, the roads going out to where they were growing their corn or whatever. And the only communication they had was the landline telephone that they used to alert us when the Japanese bombers were coming along. And the people of those villages had no communication with the outside world. We ran into villages where people didn't know who we were or what we were doing there. And it had to be explained to them that we were fighting the Japanese and the Japanese were trying to take over that part of China. So I was impressed with two things. Number one, I saw wounded Chinese from the battle and so on. I was impressed with the ability of the Chinese to withstand hardship, whether it was lack of food or enemy act, whatever it was. That ability to withstand hardship. And the other thing was the cohesion of the family. The family unit was so important. They looked after their own. They looked after their children growing up, and the children could look after their parents when they were older. And it was really remarkable. It was very impressive to us to see that part of the Chinese culture and learn something about it over there. Really remarkable people.
you have some photos in the book. I'm sure you have a lot more flying missions, or when you interacted with the Chinese civilians or soldiers on the ground, that you always in your memory that you feel like, this particular example is just impressive. I couldn't forget. Can you think of one? I'm sure there probably are many, but just one particular one that you can remember.
Well, what I'm not going to use an example, but I saw a lot of injured Chinese soldiers at one point. I think the thing that struck me most was to go into a village like in Yunnan, in the village, and see what the people accomplished without any of the things that I was used to, like motor vehicles, and electricity, and all the things that we take for granted, that our ancestors, well, not 100 years ago, 125 years ago, our ancestors didn't have electricity and didn't have gasoline and so on. And you find people that were living just fine under those circumstances now. And it was such an impression that the Chinese took this for normal, because it was normal, and that they had adapted so well that under difficult circumstances, they were doing fine. And it was just sort of eye-opening for me, as I say. It was a postgraduate education. Mm-hmm. I had seen so much tragedy in India, where they had this awful famine and all kinds of disease and difficulty. And to go over to just the impact of China on me was such a contrast, including the fact that it was beautiful fall weather, and it was just like dying and going to heaven coming out of the monsoon season in India, with all of the problems those people had, with people dying in the streets.
Yeah, in Yunnan, most parts, the weather condition is better. And also there is abundance of natural resources.
I signed up for it. But to give you an example of what is so good, my favorite place to go in Yunnan was Dali and the lake.
Dali.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I said, that is going to be a great tourist place someday. And it is now.
Oh, it is today, yes.
Yeah. It's full of resorts. Mm-hmm. It was such a great place, my goodness. And there was just the one town down on the southwest corner on the Burma Road, on the old Burma Road, and that's where the town was. Our most westerly base, we had one base west of Yunnan, and that was Baoshan. That was the nearest thing to the Salween.
Did you go to Baoshan?
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned several times about Yunnan, but Yunnan is still, it's a town, so it's a fairly large. Do you remember, is it in the center of the town, or did you go to the neighboring villages? Do you remember?
We went not very far away from where our base was.
Okay.
And we always used to go to one restaurant, and if I walked in, they looked at me and they'd say, "Egg for young."
Egg for, yeah, egg for.
We all like that.
Yeah.
And but we didn't go to the center. I don't know what the population of Yunnan was at that time, but that was a major base. And if something was going wrong in Kunming, a plane coming over the hump could land at Yunnan. Didn't have to go on to Kunming, which wasn't far away by air.
Yeah, Yunnan was a pretty big base.
Yeah.
In Yunnan. And also there was American, it was before you, I think you probably remember his name, that he later on died because his plane was shot by the Japanese, and he was trying to land away from Yunnan town, so it was too late for him to jump to parachute, and he died. Do you remember a story like that?
Yeah, he didn't want to go into the houses.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
that was a very bravery act
Yeah.
of him, and the Chinese people really appreciate that.
Yeah.
They had a big monument there, and I think it was somewhere, even in this country, somewhere there is a bronze bust of him. Maybe in the Bush presidential library somewhere.
Ed Rector, who was one of the original Flying Tigers, was from Western North Carolina, and he was a full colonel at the end of the war. And I took a picture of him with General Stone, who was replacing General Chennault, and gave the copy of that picture of him to his sister, who lived in Durham, 12 miles from here, and also his niece, who was married to the chancellor of the University of North Carolina.
Hmm.
But Ed Rector is dead now, but he was the head of the 53rd Bomb Group at the end of the war. He was one of the senior officers from the original. I think he was the most senior officer from the original Flying Tiger group.
I'm impressed by your sharp memory. You still remember 53rd group after so many years. That's amazing. And I remember, did you kind of remember coming across your book? Do you remember?
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, after the war, I think there were some people in San Francisco that got some poisoned soybean sauce or something. But that was one of the things that we were very careful about. We used rice alcohol to make ourselves some drinks. But the rice alcohol that we got from the vehicles was okay. The Japanese had anything to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
But we had to be very careful. And then to end the war, late in the war, we had in an area where there was cholera, and the only thing we could drink was water that was boiled, and it had halazone put in it, and then it was put in blister bags, and we had to fill our own blister bag at a canteen, in our canteen. Couldn't use a cup for coffee or anything. The only thing we could drink was water out of our canteen. We got out of that blister bag, and that water had been boiled, and it had halazone chlorine in it. And none of us got cholera, but there was cholera in the area, and I can't tell you just where that was. Because after the end of the Salween campaign, we went back to the Kunming and Chenkang area, right, Chenkang being on the lake, south of Kunming, of course, on the east side of the lake. And after we were there for a while, we were sent down to Nanning in Guangxi province, out on the China Sea, out near Hainan Island. And we didn't know why at that time, but the reason we were being sent down there was when they had the invasion that was supposed to come in November 1945. They were also going to come into the Luzhou area with American troops there to get behind the Chinese, so that the Chinese, and behind the Japanese, so the Japanese would not only have Americans invading on the east side, but they couldn't escape through Burma or any place else because there'd be another American force behind them. That's why we were down in Nanning in Guangxi province when they dropped the atom bomb. And then we sat there for a while, and the bomb went down in early August, and then on the 1st of September, that was the end of the war. And so then from there, we were lucky enough, I took a group to Hangzhou, which was a nice place to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in Hangzhou until time to go to Shanghai and go home.
And that was what time when you were
Okay,
coming home?
I went to Hangzhou in September.
It's in the book, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, well,
Yeah, and what may not be in the book, we wondered, we Americans, I was living at the end in what was the Broadway Mansions Hotel. It later became the Shanghai Mansions. It's on Suqiao Creek, has a curved front, right where Suqiao Creek runs into the Huangpu. And it was designed by an American architect, built before the war. And we were sitting there and saying, we saw American ships out in the river, and they're saying, why aren't we going home? You know, the war had been over since the 1st of September, in effect, and here it is Thanksgiving time and nothing's happening, we're not hearing anything. Well, the reason we weren't going home then was the General Marshal in Washington said the #1 priority is to get the Japanese prisoners out of China and back to Japan before the Chinese take out revenge for Nanking, and get the Japanese out of there to avoid bloodshed. And he was correct. Because I can tell you that we had Japanese prisoners that were working on tearing down revetments that had been put up by Shanghai or wherever the aerodrome was to take the revetments down, and the Japanese were working, and the Chinese pilots would, if a Japanese was working up on top of a revetment, a Japanese pilot flying a fighter plane would try to give him a haircut, you know, would fly over him, scare him to death. And General Marshall said, we don't want Japanese and Chinese mixing at all. So the Japanese were taken out of there, and then we got out. And then the other thing was, when we finally got to Seattle at the end of December, they couldn't take the troops off the ship because Fort Lawton was filled up. They couldn't get the troops out of Fort Lawson because all the troop trains going east were filled up. You know, it was just a big transportation bottleneck. So what General Marshall did all was made perfect sense. And
yeah, certainly towards the end, you know, if it's not controlled, then you know, certain individuals will take revenge. That's for sure. So I want to ask you one specific question. That is, stay in Kunming when the war was still going on. Did you see anyone that you knew at the time who, I mean American pilots, who flew out for a mission and never returned? You know, who probably went out to bomb a target but was shot down or crashed?
I did for Union Heat, but it could have been I wasn't involved with air operations. I was just waiting to move on.
Okay.
Both times, the original time, and then after the assault wing campaign when I was in Kunming and Chiang Kung, waiting to go someplace, and turned out it to be to Nanning in Guangxi province. I didn't know where we were going, but we knew that we weren't needed on the Burma side of China anymore, and we were going to go someplace. And of course, we didn't know anything about the invasion of Japan. We assumed Japan would be invaded sometime, but we didn't know what the plans were.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because sometimes it's really hard. If you have a friend who is who flew out with a fighter or a bomber, and then who never returned, it's really hard. Some people
when McKinney went out on November 5th of 1944, and I sent him out, and he didn't come back, and Sterling Barrow, who lives in Texas, whose birthday was a week or so ago, he's 97, we stood out there and we looked at you, we knew that he had to have run out of fuel by that time we were talking, that he he was down someplace, one way or another.
So he never made it.
But he never got back. No, he died.
But
yeah.
Was he recovered later or no?
Hmm?
Was he recovered, or he's just listed as missing?
Well, his Don Jackson is looking.
Oh, Don Jackson is looking.
It's that same plane.
Okay.
He was the first, and my last one was the last week of the war with guys.
But he's looking for the what? It's in northern Thailand, right?
Hmm?
Is he missing in the northern Thailand area?
Yeah, I sent missions out to Thailand. Sure,
Okay.
that's where I sent him.
Okay. I also remember, maybe this is the last, that, you know, the story about American Flying Tigers, or later on the 14th Air Force and others. The story is not known to a lot of people, especially for the young people. You know, you want to tell your story, you want to share this with more people. Why do you think that way? Because you feel like the story is good for, you know, Chinese Americans, or?
Well, if you take the average young American now in high school or college and say, tell me about World War II, what was World War II about? Where was all that? Oh, that was the war in Europe that was involved in Europe, and then the Japanese attacked the United States, and then it was in the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese fleet and the American fleet, and then finally the American fleet, the Battle of Midway, and so on. And the word China is not likely to come into that conversation. And those of us who were there think that at the time, I mean, when we were going, we had come across the Atlantic Ocean, went through the Suez Canal, we're out in the Red Sea, and we tell the troops, we're going to China. And our troops said, where the hell is China? And we told them where China was. Well, what's that got to do with World War II? The war's in Europe and the Pacific. What's that got to do with China? And my answer was, you'll find out when you get there. But, you know, it was the kids today, the movies, the television stuff, it's all about the war in Europe and so on, and the naval warfare. And the war in China is just not that exciting, I guess. It doesn't sell books or whatever very much.
Yeah, unfortunately, actually there are a lot of exciting stories about China.
More people in China than in Europe, for
Right.
us, too.
And there are several things well, the good thing is, in recent years, in the last few years, a couple of movies came out, even movies made in this country, about, in general, not just the Flying Tigers, but in general, the American Air Force in China. And there was one movie, I can't remember the name now, but it's about I think it's the Doolittle mission, when they crash landing in China, how the Chinese civilians were trying to rescue them.
That's right. There were 16 B-25.
And a lot of Chinese also, many more Chinese died because of that effort, because the Japanese hated. So they took revenge and destroyed many villages there.
Yeah.
So all that kind of story is really important to everyone, to the Americans and Chinese to remember. And the other story is
Supposed to be executed by the Japanese. Fortunately, at the end of the war, they were not executed, but they were in danger, and the Japanese didn't hesitate to execute anybody that was helping us in any way, and including their own civilians. And it was unfortunate. Now, after 1949, in the years following 49, those years, if you were to ask a high school kid in China in 1955, probably, did you ever hear about the Americans in China during the war? No, I never heard of them. You know, we were not discussed for a long time.
Yeah, unfortunately, after 45, yeah, it's,
Yeah,
oh no, after 49, yeah.
After
it's,
49.
yeah.
And we were sort of a lost chapter in the history of China. But now it's come back, and I was invited to come over to dedicate a monument and so on. And things have changed, and it's as it should be.
Yeah.
Because both the United States and China had a very big part in getting things settled in that end of the world.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I feel so pleased that we can collect stories like yours that can be shared with many people. Chinese,
Which we are not invaded or attacked,
right.
or one of our close allies like China or like Canada or Mexico is.
Right.
But this business of going out as Western man has done through the centuries, notably the British Empire, to go out and just grab other people's real estate and make it part of an empire. And the Romans did it, but the British did it on a bigger scale than anybody else. And it's bad. We can help each other. If the United States and China economically could do so much for each other and help so much for the working people of both countries and so on, that all of this stuff that's going on in trade wars and all is very sad.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Very
Of course, there are even.
We all chipped in. He had how much money each other put in. So he went in India, he bought all this rum, I think
Oh,
it was,
wow.
and just in bulk,
Uh-huh.
and put it in one of the tanks, the 150-gallon gas tank, and a brand new tank that was clean. And the first thing, and he was coming back over the hump, and he switched tanks because he was getting low on fuel in the other tank. He had plenty of gas left, but he switched to use the external tank so that he would bounce the way of the airplane, and the engine started to not function. He realized he made a mistake. So when he corrected that, well, the problem was that during this process, a little bit of gasoline got over into the tank that had the alcohol in it. And he asked our medical director, what do we do? What should we do? And the doctor said, you pour a bottle of that stuff, and you and I will drink it tonight and both get drunk, and if we're not dead in the morning, we'll never tell anybody.
Oh.
And so we all got our liquor and drank it happily,
Okay.
and never do. And I got this story many years later, 1960, I think. I was a student at the War College in Washington, and all of a sudden, one of the professors turned out to be my old boss, my old squadron commander. So he and his wife and my wife and I had dinner that night, and he told me that story. He said, now it can be told. The service, I went in as an Air Force intelligence officer, having graduated from intelligence school at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and was in a reconnaissance, a photo reconnaissance squadron, in which we had P-38 aircraft known as F-5s, and I was in that reconnaissance business throughout the war. We went across the Atlantic and in North Africa and through the Suez Canal and Red Sea to India, and wound up after 5 months of travel in China, where we were part of the 14th Air Force that was the outgrowth of the Flying Tigers. And we started off in Western China, a small group of us, a detachment that was called a flight of the squadron, a part of the squadron. We were G Flight or George Flight, and we started off the war against the Salween, against the Japanese in the Salween campaign. The Japanese at that time in Burma were trying to move east towards Kunming to join with Japanese, it would be moving west towards Kunming. And that was the early part of the war, of our war years. And we wound up, after meeting the Japanese in the Salween campaign, we wound up at the end of the war down in Nanning in Guangxi province in South China in anticipation of an invasion of Japan that would include having an American force come into South China and get behind the Japanese forces in China. And we were there until the end of the war, after the dropping of the nuclear weapon, and the end of the war in early September of 1945. Now, during that time, there were a lot of exciting experiences. I think the thing that strikes me most in my recollection was a typhoon in Nanning when we evacuated our airplanes and we got up into the hilltops, the city being underwater, and we got the word about a bomb that had dropped on Japan that was just unheard of, this huge weapon, and it might be the end of the war. That was the biggest memory I have, because it turned out to be true, of course, but it was totally something that we never would have thought of or conceived of before. We had other exciting moments. I guess the happiest moment I had during the war itself was when I arrived in China, and China was so beautiful where we were in Yunnan province. Wonderful weather, friendly people. Everybody seemed to be happy that we were there. And it was really a lift that I needed after several months in Japan, in India during the monsoon, the bad weather, and the people who had suffered so horribly from famine the year before. And the bad weather and all the conditions were very depressing. And to get into China and be welcomed by the people and enjoy the new environment and the western part of Yunnan province was a delightful place. The only place we had heard about it in that part of the world that was equally attractive was Kashmir, the Vale of Kashmir. But we were in a very, very lovely part of China, and I have often thought about the Lake Tali that was right near where we were stationed, and I used to drive my Jeep over the rough remains of the Burma Road to get there on every possible occasion.
Lake Dali, okay. So you want to...
Europe always had wars. They were talking about the war in Europe and the Japanese attack on the United States and our fighting back and our really destroying the Japanese fleet. And the major conflict with the Japanese was in the Pacific Ocean. And so all of the part of the war that is so vivid in my memory, in my mind, is sort of lost in the textbooks now for young people in this country, in China and elsewhere, because it wasn't the big thing that was going on. There was the war in Europe, of course, and the Nazis and the Hitler's rise, and the invasion, the attack by the Japanese on us, and the destruction of the Japanese fleet, and the plans for invading Japan. It's a story that needs to be told, and I would be happy if I could help tell a little bit of it.
Thank you very much.